Okay, so let's get started. Good morning. My name is Roberto Simon. I'm a Senior Director of Policy with America Society, Council of the Americas, and the head of our Anti-Corruption Working Group. We're thrilled to host this panel on the state of anti-corruption in Peru, based on the findings of the Capacity to Combat Corruption, the CCC Index. This will be the last panel on a series of events that we did related to the CCC Index, which is co-developed by COA and Control Risks. We had the launch of the index earlier this month. Then we had an event on Mexico specifically, one on Brazil, and this last one is on Peru. All of these sessions are available online. So check our YouTube channel and our website if you're interested in seeing what already happened. Before we get started, as always, a few important reminders. This panel is on the record and is being webcasted through our social media channels and website. We'll have a discussion and then some time for Q&A. If you're joining us via WebEx, please use the chat box on the right side of your screen. If you're following us via our webcast, tag us or use the hashtag CCC Index. You can tag ASCOA or America's Quarterly and we'll see your question. For those of you on WebEx, please keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation. This panel is being sponsored by Control Risks, and we're also grateful to the generous support of the other sponsors of the Anti-Corruption Working Group, CFA Institute, Millicom, and Cleary and Gottlieb. Without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished panelists today. Samuel Rotta is the Executive Director of Proética, the Peruvian chapter of Transparency International. Samuel is based in Lima. We also have Nicolás Urrutia, who's a Senior Analyst with Control Risks for the Andean region. Nicolás is based in Bogota. And Denise Rodriguez Olivari, who's a scholar and a researcher of Lava Jato in Peru and Brazil, and she's a PhD candidate at Humboldt University in Berlin. Just before we get started with the discussion, what we've been doing here is just let me present a very short PowerPoint presentation. I hope you can all see this. Just showing the results we got for Peru in the CCC index. So if you want to look at the full report, it is available on our website. But here, looking specifically at Peru, if you look at the overall ranking, Peru ranks in the 5th place with a score of 5.47. Slightly below Brazil and ahead of countries like Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. And if we compare the score Peru had this year with the score of 2019, we see that Peru was the only country among the eight countries analyzed in the 2 years where we saw some improvement. Peru had a 6% improvement in its overall score. And when you look across the region from Brazil to Mexico, either countries remain relatively stable, or we saw a decrease in the case of Brazil, a quite significant decrease, but also for Mexico and Argentina, things remain very stable. The index is comprised of 3 different subcategories. The first one we call legal capacity, related to topics like independence and efficiency of courts and enforcement agencies. The second category is what we call democracy and political institutions, related to the overall quality of democracy, but also campaign financing rules, the regulation of lobbying, and so on. And the third category is civil society, media, and the private sector. When we look at Peru, the situation is actually really interesting. We see that Peru has, if you compare to other countries, strong legal capacity at this point. But when we look at the green bar for democracy and political institution, actually Peru is together with Brazil and Colombia and below countries like Argentina. And when you look at civil society in Peru, civil society is strong, but also below countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. The last slide, these are the 14 variables that we assess I don't want to go through all of them. Again, this is all available on the report that you can find online. But it's interesting to see on the legal capacity subcategory how Peru is above the regional average for all the 7 variables analyzed, right? In some cases, like the use of leniency agreements and plea bargain instruments, Peru is significantly above the regional average. The same is true to international cooperation with authorities in places, with authorities in Latin America and the United States, Europe. But when we look at democracy and political institutions, again, Peru is either at the mark of the regional average or is actually below in cases like lawmaking, ruling processes, or the quality and enforceability of campaign financing. Lastly, civil society, media, and the private sector. When you look at the mobilization of civil society, Peru is actually doing well. We've seen several big protests related to anti-corruption, including protests that led to changes in Fiscal General and other important advancements. But when you look at education improvements, Peru is still kind of behind the curve. Let me stop here. And what we've been doing is kind of going around the room or the virtual room, stop sharing, and asking people or our distinguished speakers, what are their reaction to the findings of the CCC index? Do you agree with what we're seeing? Are we missing something? What are your main takeaways? Let me start with Samuel Rotta. Samuel, thank you again for joining us. And just full disclosure, Samuel was one of the experts who responded to the survey that we conducted for Peru. Samuel, how do you see the results? Thank you again for being with us today.
Well, Roberto, thank you, and thank you to the American Society and Control Risks for inviting me to this conversation. I think this is very, very interesting. Yes, let me start personal. It's nice to see a corruption ranking where Peru improves. And I think this is interesting because it reflects what has been going on in the country broadly, but reflects what has been at the country going through. The last couple of years has been very corruption and anti-corruption had a very important, a crucial part in the public agenda, and there was a political division along the anti-corruption line. And this is due to the importance of the Lavallato investigations. We should not put that factor out of the equation. It has been very important, and the result of having all of our former presidents investigated because of this scandal, and a number of political leaders and mayors and governors, regional governors, is not something that has to be not looked at. It's something that generates a lot of counterattacks from all of this broad and heterogeneous coalition of investigated political leaders. And I have to say that Proética, as a civil society organization, took part and took a position. And this is important to say as a disclaimer. We took a position supporting the investigations and asking for independence and to respect the autonomy of the investigative bodies. So as a first reaction is, I think it is quite accurate to reflect what has happened in our country and in general terms. But it also it also allowed us to think on what is not being achieving and this has to be with the huge number of other investigations with no public visibility, and also a number of reforms that had not have the public support, political support, but and that are pending for the next for the short and mid term.
Nicolás, you were also one of the contributors, one of the experts we asked for help analyzing Peru. How do you see the results? Are they unexpected? Also, in the context of the Andean region, what is Peru's uniqueness, and how do you see the situation now? Thank you again for joining us today.
Right. Well, thank you, Roberto, and thank you to AS, Council of the Americas. I would say, and much in agreement with that Peru's efforts over the last couple of years are reflected in this improvement. And I think that Peru has been one of the relative few countries in the region where anti-corruption efforts have not stopped at rhetoric or have not limited themselves at rhetoric. But they have actually involved action, political action, making hard political decisions, following through with them. Just the fact, and this is obviously fairly evident to everyone, but the fact that dissolved a Congress due to fundamentally gridlock and fundamental disagreements regarding anti-corruption reform, the fact that Peru over the last couple of years has not only criminally investigated, but also sentenced former heads of state is obviously something without parallel, at least in its extent, when you compare it to other countries in the region. It certainly has not been the case in Colombia or in many other neighboring countries that we could bring to mention. So I believe the overall result and the trend is reflective of a very significant sustained effort that is multi-pronged, as you mentioned, in different categories that we assess. It involves public policy, but it involves the public sector, but it also involves the media, civil society, and other stakeholders. And that is worth considering and recognizing. Of course, the significant question is how much of this trend is sustainable, and what can we expect, in 2021 and in 2022. But I believe we'll have some time later on in the discussion to address some of those issues.
Absolutely. Denise, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today. What are your main takeaways from the CCC Index?
Thank you, Roberto, for the invitation, and also AS and the Council of Americas. Well, I will have to say that the CCC Index captures what had happened in the last year. Of course, this is a progress in a country where, for example, the judiciary has only the 15% of the budget they requested. So they are working with a lot of, say, staff and budget limitations. And despite the fact that that's the case, and adding the internal and external pressures to prosecute former heads of states, businessmen, really high-profile politicians, mostly from across the political spectrum, we can see some interesting findings and some achievements. But I would like to be very cautious about this, because I think that when we talked about Lava Jato in Brazil, we all get very excited, and we were expecting some more breakthroughs. So in Peru, and the COVID-19 situation What also created is that all investigations have stalled. As predicted, I mean, everything is closed. No one is currently working from their current offices, so we cannot expect the investigations to continue. Another interesting fact is that a lot of people are under pretrial detention, but there's only one high-profile politician that it's actually convicted. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. But given the situation I just briefly explained, we are optimistic about the results, but still we have to wait what else is going on. There are other phenomena aside the Lava Jato case that actually are playing a part in the fight against corruption in Peru. I guess we will talk more about it in the second round of questions, but Lava Judge, which is Lava Juez, related to a lot of judges and prosecutors in a series of wiretapping audios in another investigation, which actually played in parallel with Lava Jato. So created a very complex anti-corruption environment.
Yeah, several big investigations going on, but let's start with Lava Jato, which is already huge, a lot to discuss about. And I know you're doing a lot of research into Lava Jato, analyzing the situation in Peru and comparing it to Brazil. We have some big trials ahead of us. Ollanta Humala, Keiko Fujimori, probably Alejandro Toledo, former President Alejandro Toledo will be extradited from the US. What are kind of the key things we should be paying attention to when it comes to Lava Jato for the next 6 months or so? What is your take on kind of where the investigation is going?
Well, mainly accusations. The special prosecutor team had a lot of support among the people, but the thing is, people are waiting for actually accusations, because right now we're in the pre-trial detentions and the investigation period. Again, they're working under very precarious conditions. I mean, I visited both, I did field work, so I visited both the public prosecution in Brazil and in Peru, and you can see the difference in terms of building, budget, security measures. You can see that really working with the odds against them rather than working in a very enable environment, which make everything even more difficult. Another thing that I think people should take in consideration is that most of the accused people are among the risk population and the COVID-19. So many of them have been released from jail because Peruvian jails are already overpopulated. So that's another kind of twist that people wasn't expecting at all, but it's happening, and it is responding to a global pandemic. But again, I guess it might play against the perception that things were moving forward instead of moving backwards. So I think that COVID-19 situation, in terms of timing, in terms of this house arrest, I mean, the change of the penitentiary regimes, might be playing against the overall perception that things are working. But just let's bear that in mind, that it's just responsive to a delicate and very concrete situation in a global pandemic.
Samuel, Nicolás mentioned the Disillusion of Congress earlier this year, and we have a very different Congress right now compared to the one we had before in Peru, where major parties like Fuerza Popular, they are weaker or smaller, with less seats in Congress. And we have a more fragmented legislative chamber in Peru, which also poses questions regarding the future of the Vizcarra's anti-corruption agenda, right? With topics like legislative immunity or broader political reform. What are the risks of, having a big corruption investigation that decimates the political establishment and ending up, we'll have elections soon, presidential election next year in Peru, and end up with an anti-establishment figure, much like what we've seen in Brazil? How likely is the Brazil scenario for Peru right now, in your opinion?
Well, This is a very interesting question. My feeling is that it's very difficult that some individual like Bolsonaro that channelize the anti-corruption anger from the people come forward, and I don't think it's a very I don't think that's a possible scenario. Let's remember that corruption in our country has been in the public agenda for a very long time. No, even before Fujimori fell in 2000. Let's remember that Lima was the venue of the anti-corruption International Anti-Corruption Conference in 1997, with opening remarks by Fujimori himself. And after the regime collapsed, the anti-corruption issue democratized and went all over the candidates in the different elections, except probably in 2006 when Alan Garcia very skillfully evaded because of his past in the 80s. But nowadays, anti-corruption is something that both radicals that want the death, how do you say, the pena de muerte, death for corrupts, and those moderates that want reforms. Everybody talks about this, and it's difficult that one candidate can collect all of the anger and all of the people is feeling, and that's what I don't see that a possibility in our country.
And Nicolás, still on this point, we're seeing certain cases of COVID-19 in Peru. The situation is getting really ugly, despite the fact that Vizcarra was one of the first to really impose a strict quarantine. We were discussing before that this is directly related with the fact that Peru has very high rates of informal labor, right? Do you think moving forward, we'll continue to see anti-corruption being a top priority in the political space, particularly as we get closer to the presidential election? But do you think other topics, healthcare with COVID-19, the economic impact of the crisis, will somehow, overshadow the issue of corruption? What is your take?
We believe that is very likely. The latest projections on the economic impact of COVID point to Peru's GDP shrinking by 12.6% in 2020, which is socially devastating. It sets the country back. It would set any country back multiple years, if not decades, in terms of social development, establishing and sustaining a stable middle class, and so on. So the economic impact and the social corollary that comes with that is very likely to become the new central talking point as we look toward elections in 2021, both for Congress and the president, as well as the central talking point in politics more generally. Now, there are, of course, anti-corruption angles to that. We've seen various reports already of anti-corruption investigations related to apparently fraudulent or overpriced purchase of medical equipment in the framework of the COVID emergency. And the Peruvian authorities, or at least some part of the Peruvian authorities, are moving forward with those types of investigations. So Anti-corruption and COVID do not necessarily compete with each other in terms of, it is either one or the other. There are anti-corruption angles to COVID, just as like there are anti-corruption angles to any major national event. But the immediate concern with providing daily subsistence to the millions of Peruvians who have already been very hard hit with the pandemic and are likely to continue to be hard hit over the next couple of months, we believe is going to be the new central axis of Peruvian politics and electoral politics particularly.
Let me go back to Samuel and ask him specifically about COVID-19. I know Proética was among a few Transparency International chapters that sounded the alarm about increased corruption risk related to COVID-19 back in early to mid-March, right? And basically, we kind of knew that this would happen, and here we are, right? Was it, when you look at the situation in Peru, as Nicolás was mentioning, it's a story of overpriced supplies it has been sold to governments, problems with procurement, lack of controls. Do you think this could have been avoided, and how do you see the situation moving forward? Are we in a better position to avoid big corruption scandals related to COVID-19?
Well, that's a difficult question. Let's start with this. The special prosecutor in charge of anti-corruption crimes has been reporting about the number of cases. He and all of his offices in the territory are handling. And the last report I heard last week, I think, was 800 and something cases related to corruption, to mismanagement of funds since the emergency started in mid-March. So it's a huge number, and for sure, I think a group of those cases will be dismissed, but probably another important group will confirm that mayors, regional governors, or officers in ministries have been taking advantage of the situation. We recommended at the very beginning, let's do this in the most transparent way possible, because even when the comptroller office started to applying a control modality, a control mode, parallel to the procurement process, it was not going to be possible to cover the whole universe of procurement processes, or donations to people in vulnerability, in economic vulnerability. So let's do this the most transparent way possible. And I mean, at some point we have raised the bar. We have by now a database on the procurement processes open for anyone to see. We have a specific line within the budget to track the money that goes to combat the emergency, but still it's too much money. It's too much money involved, and too many people, too many institutions doing things that is very difficult. So what we expect by now is, okay, those 800 cases that you are handling by now, let's be very rigorous and keep track on how do they evolve in the next year or 2 years, and let's have this story of corruption within the COVID-19 very clear and use it as as an example of how not to do things in similar scenarios later. Huh?
And Denise, a big part of this equation is about enforcement capacity, right? You were mentioning a huge corruption scandal in Peru involving judges and who were selling sentences in a court very close to Lima, in the outskirts of Lima. There were prosecutors also involved, apparently, in this case. My understanding is that no one has been convicted. It's still under investigation. When you look at the judicial system in Peru, when you look at the structure of kind of the prosecutorial bodies, the police investigating white-collar crime, what are the biggest challenges here? We had, in the case of Chávarri, was a top prosecutor. We saw huge mobilization in the streets to get him to resign amid a big infight involving Lava Jato. But how do you see the problem of corruption for these institutions?
Well, that's a big challenge because many of the judges and prosecutors involved in that network are still in office. So we don't see many changes regarding that topic. I mean, just recently, Galvez is asking not to be investigated, and we see Chávarri being shielded yet again by the Congress. So we see a lot of political interference in terms of how to deal with these key players in the judiciary still having a prominent role in different series of, for example, the board of supreme prosecutors of the justice, the National Justice Board. So it's let's say that the progress is taking place amidst the regular business as usual judiciary setting. I mean, nothing has changed among those players, and that's the most worrisome thing, because we cannot achieve great transformations within the judiciary or the public ministry until we really change those figures, these controversial figures that are under investigation or are escaping investigation at all.
We're going to open for Q&A shortly, so if you have questions, we're already receiving a few questions. If you're on the WebEx platform, send your question via using the chat box. If you're following us through a web stream, tag us ASCOA or America's Quarterly, or use the hashtag CCC Index. We'll see your question and it will be asked here. But before we do that, Nicolás, let's talk a little bit about kind of the economic impact of anti-corruption in Peru, which I think is a huge topic. At one point, there were estimations that the Lava Jato operation was costing something like 2.5% of Peru's GDP. This figure was contested by some, but in any case, it's clear that you have major infrastructure projects that are either abandoned or paralyzed, job losses, etc. And as always, we've seen this discussion kind of everywhere in the region that, Latin America still needs to do a much better job in punishing corruptions that are caught, punishing companies that are caught in corruption scandals and are convicted. Is Peru doing better compared to when we started with Lava Jato, or is there a clear path forward in this context? So what is your view?
I think it is undoubtedly doing much better. And again, this I think goes to the first point of comparing the results from the 2020 CCC index to 2019, the persistence of the current administration, President Vizcarra's anti-corruption agenda over the last couple of years, along with other enablers and very important stakeholders, civil society being a key one among them, has definitely promoted real and effective reforms. But a number of those reforms still need to mature, still need to be fully enforced. Let us say the legal architecture, whether you're talking about plea bargain agreements or other aspects, has made very significant strides. But to Denise's point, now you really need to use those legal tools, and you need to use them consistently and repeatedly, so as to demonstrate that this is not just specific to Lava Jato or any other big case, but that this is the way that the Peruvian judicial system operates. And that is a matter of persistence, of repetition, of building that institutional credibility, ultimately, that provides effective deterrence over the medium and long term. Now, that said, you were asking, or you mentioned companies and the way that companies feel about operating in Peru. Our experience with clients has certainly been that they, either companies that operate in Peru or companies that are interested in operating in Peru, are far more stringent and far more careful about their decisions, that they understand far better that they have obligations to conduct effective and real due diligence, and not simply check a box, let us say, on a standard format, but actually make sure that they understand who they might be doing business with in Peru, their political connections and so on. And that is improvement. That said, of course, it is still improvement within a context, within a regional context, where the maturity, for instance, of corporate compliance practices is still has considerable room for growth and improvement. And there is, I would say, still significant differences between how companies that are used to operating within very stringent jurisdictions approach this problem to how companies operating in less stringent jurisdictions approach this problem. Companies used to operating and complying with European standards or North American standards on anti-corruption, on anti-bribery, and that have all those processes and capabilities built into the corporate structure, approach this as a matter of just day-to-day business, whereas companies that perhaps come from other parts of the world or even within Latin America that do not necessarily have that same experience and have had that same exposure and legal obligation are still very much in the process of developing those processes.
We're starting to get some really interesting questions from participants, people who are watching us. Let me start with one for Denise. There's one question by Esteban Sandoval regarding the fact that many of the people who have been arrested in this big anti-corruption operations are under preventive detention. And after an extended period of time, they successfully argued for their release. And the question is, how can this be avoided? And we've seen people like PPK, who's, I don't recall exactly his age, but he's kind of an elder who's with house arrest. And, the debates about the legality and the legitimacy on the use of preventive arrest in Peru. How do you see this? Do you think prosecutors will be changing their strategy, or are we seeing any evolution? And is this a new debate for anti-corruption enforcement? You're still on mute. It happens. Okay.
Thank you. I mean, this is not new. For many people, especially from outside Peru, the pretrial detention system seems a bit odd, because usually you are away from jail until you're proven that you're guilty. This is a legal yet controversial mechanism that it's in place in the criminal penal code here in Peru. I mean, there's no evidence that has been any collusion between the prosecution and the judges in order to order these sentences. In fact, sometimes the prosecution asks for more time that the judge actually grants. So in that case, I mean, in terms of the how the legal process works, there is a request and there's eventually a sentence. So in that term, that works without any interference. On the second level, Peru has actually been decreasing the number of people under pretrial detention in jails. I mean, this is a problem. It's not only in Peru. It's not only in Brazil. It happens everywhere. It happens in the US. I mean, the percentage of people without a sentence, it's quite high around the world. In Peru, actually, the number of months that you could be under pretrial detention has been increased in the past Congress, proposed by the majoritarian political group that was led by Keiko Fujimori, because during that time, actually, the only one that was under suspicion of being involved in Lavallato was Humala. So we can see some political maneuver to kind of shape or interfere in certain process that eventually end up playing against most of them, if not all. Another issue is that most of them are in certain age or have a lot of illnesses or other conditions that put them in risk. For example, right now with COVID-19, and they're being released. I mean, the only one I can think of is still in jail because he has a sentence is Felix Moreno, who was the regional governor of Callao.
We have a question for Samuel, pushing back on your argument that a Bolsonaro-style leader is unlikely to emerge in Peru. Basically, the person, it's Michael Benny from Twitter. He's asking, doesn't the fact that most political parties have been contaminated by corruption make that scenario more likely? And he points to the fact that Antauro Humala's party and FREPAP did surprisingly well in the last election. And I would add, do you think, we saw small parties with a very radical agenda doing well in the legislative elections? Do you think this was something kind of limited to the context of the January elections, or are you expecting these parties to become kind of more influential in Peru moving forward?
Let's see. The party led by Antauro Humala from jail is, probably the most radical in this kind of issues. I mean, they have proposals to introduce a death penalty for corruption, for example, which is at the same time worrying, but quite funny, because his main speaker, the main speaker of this party in the Congress, is the former Comptroller General of the country, who is facing 7 accusations of corruption during his time leading the Comptroller office. So if this kind of law eventually pass, which is not likely, he would be probably somebody who been killed by this. But I stick to my original argument. I don't think it's possible. I don't see how. Everybody is somehow involved, and the need of the people to have an iron fist against corruption has been moved from the politicians to the Lavallato prosecutors task force, for example. The people see and praise the detentions, for example. They somehow people think or feel more than think, feel that this brings a little bit of justice at the end. So this kind of support, which in Proética's National Survey on Corruption of last December, the support is quite clear. 1 out of 2 Peruvians think they are doing great against corruption. This support, takes the anti-corruption agenda out of the politicians and leave them without floor to talk to get even more radical. That's what I think about that.
Mm-hmm. And Nicolás, what is your take on this issue? Are we likely to see a Brazil scenario, and what's the future of kind of Peru's political parties or Peru's party system moving forward?
Well, I am not entirely convinced, and I would have to agree with Samuel on this. I'm not entirely convinced that Bolsonaro's the right or the most likely point of comparison. I do believe that there is a higher probability over the next few months that we will see a rise in leftist populism as opposed to right populism. Now, because of the highly fractured, highly splintered nature of the current Congress, and because of the structural weaknesses of the parties that are currently represented in Congress, it is still, I think, difficult to envision who the final official candidates will be and how likely those candidates are to actually draw votes to their platforms when push comes to shove. But the probability, the scenarios under which a wave of left-wing populism, but populism in the end, including perhaps heavy-handed approaches to justice and a very highly punitive approach to justice would win considerable electoral support is a possibility that we believe is quite likely. We simply do not know yet who will have their name in front of that platform, but we do believe it is quite likely to occur.
And let me bring this to Denise. There's one question about Vizcarra's role in the anti-corruption push, right? This has been kind of his top priority from the beginning after the fall of PPK. How do you see the role that he played in the anti-corruption space? How important was Vizcarra or has been Vizcarra for this, in your opinion?
Given the nature of the political system in Peru, the president as head of state has a very important role. Not only rhetorically, among all his speeches, he repeated the word anti-corruption, fight against corruption several times. We'll see some concrete actions in the fight of against corruption. But again, let's remember that he doesn't have a party. He's been untouched so far by this scandal. So he kind of has this political, let's say, support, and also being not contaminated by the accusations. Again, I say so far because when we say lavallato, you just open a box and there are a lot of people implicated. But his role has been quite important, pivotal, just to move certain things forward. A lot of people supported the closure of the Congress, despite the controversy behind it. We had that before and also was supported by population. But because we reached a deadlock between the legislative and the executive that couldn't be resolved any other way. So with that in place, there are some things that now are taking place, like, for example, the Justice National Board. We'll see some other changes, for example, in terms of anti-corruption and the political reform. So yes, his role has been very important.
Let me ask you a second question. We have actually two questions, one from Will Freeman and the other one also from Twitter. I can see the person who asked about corruption at the local level in Peru, right? And I have to say that our anti-corruption working group is working on a case study looking at corruption in the Peruvian Amazon and the sale of land and how this contributed to deforestation in Ucayali. And it's, writing this case study, and I visited Peru to do that. It was interesting because Peru, in Lima, we see everyone talking about anti-corruption. You go to a library or to a bookstore, you have a part of the bookstore dedicated exclusively to corruption, and it is what drives politics in many ways in Peru. But then you get to a place like Ucayali or the Altiplano, and corruption is really endemic at the local level. We don't see strong enforcement capacity. We see judges that are very influenced by kind of local business groups and so on. What is the solution to that? Of course, there is an institutional building process that needs to take place, but what is Peru doing really to address corruption at the local level, including on topics like decentralization? There's an argument to be made that decentralization actually increased corruption in Peru. And what is the kind of the future of this discussion, and where do you see things going?
As you mentioned, the fact that the decentralization process took place less than 20 years ago, and we see a lot of corruption in big infrastructure projects. For example, the first convicted was in the regional president of Ancash, which is another region where a big highway was built. I see this problem goes across capacity building and budget. I mean, we're talking about a power, like the judiciary power, that has the 15% of the budget they usually request. And not even that, since Lavallato started, they're even receiving even less than that. So they have to do really great things with so little money. I mean, the terms are how people are appointed, how people are removed, how precarious and how they face personal, for example, insecurities. They have to take care of their safety. A lot of people died, for example, during the investigation to this very controversial Cesar Alvarez politician in Ancash. So they really have to fight against a lot of the interplay of informal businesses, money laundering, illegal mining, illegal logging, other politicians, personal interest. It's quite difficult. I mean, I anticipate a lot of problems, and especially with COVID, we've seen that so far with these 3 months of lockdown, more than 300 judges and prosecutors are involved in accused of corruption. So, I mean, the panorama is not looking that optimistic in that term. And as you say, you see something in Lima, and you see it works, and then you go beyond, you go to other regions, and you will see a very different scenario. It's worrisome. Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, so let me go around the room with one question, which is, do you think Peru will continue to do better in the CCC index next year? In other words, do you think that the improvement we've seen now, is it something limited to the current circumstances under Vizcarra, etc., and as we move forward, the situation might stabilize or even deteriorate? Or do you think what we're actually seeing is sustained progress that will continue over the next few years or so? Let me start with Nicolás, and thank you again for participating today?
Well, it will really hinge on, I believe, on improvements in those areas of the index that rely more on the actions of civil society and the media. Because the political capacity to continue to push forth improvements will be limited, at least over the next 12 months, by circumstances we've already discussed at length. So it is not as much a lack of intent on the government's part or on the executive's part, but a limitation on what it can realistically achieve over the next 12 months in these circumstances. So there is room, of course, for sustained improvement based largely on the dedication of organizations such as Proética and independent researchers, the media, but there is limited ability we believe, on the government's part to keep doing much more than it already has for the remainder of Vizcarra's term.
Samuel, what's your take?
Well, the index, the result of this index, of this year's index, is driven by the episode of Lava Jato. This is quite clear, and other grand corruption cases too. But the challenge is going to be how do we move forward beyond the episodes to the structures, and this has to deal with current reforms, and right now we are in a difficult situation in terms of reforms, and as mentioned previously, the political reform needs to be completed, and then we have to start to see enforcement of it, and the judicial reform is still pending to provide the first results. And besides that, we have a number of other reforms pending. The procurement system reforms, the reform is something that hasn't been discussed yet. And Lava Jato had this two-pronged, it's a case with two prongs. The political finance but also the procurement of mega infrastructure. And about this, we haven't seen much, but a couple of officials, of public officials from Proinversión detained and investigated, but not all of the spirit and movement that we have been seen in the political side of the equation. So these are my takes.
Right, and Denise, what is your view?
Now I'm on mute. Drawing upon what Samuel said, on the political front, as he mentioned, there's been some improvement. I mean, at least in terms of the reforms in the legislation. But again, what happens when you go to the National Office of Electoral Processes and you only have 30 controllers for all the candidates nationwide? I mean, you have a lot of problems dealing with this budget and staff resources. I mean, there's a lot of limitations. What happened on the other front, when the same system that was in place when Odebrecht operated is still in place. So I guess in terms of political will, yes, we reach a point that I think, as Nicolás also mentioned, the people did up to whatever they need to do, but now we need to see concrete results in terms of more budget allocation and really big reforms that can actually shake the environment. Not to talking only about Lava Jato, but talking about from Lava Jato onwards. I think we cannot afford to miss another opportunity, and I'm not saying this as a Peruvian citizen, to miss another opportunity in the fight against corruption. We've seen this before. when the demise of the Fujimori regime. I mean, we need to take this as a really opportunity, not to be another failed opportunity in the fight against corruption in the region.
So with this message of cautious optimism, I think the three of you agree on that. Let me thank all of you for being with us today. Again, this is the last event we're doing in the CCC Index series. Everything is available online, as well as the report. If you have any questions, do reach out to our anti-corruption working group. And I hope to see you all again next year when we launch the 2021 edition of the Index. Thank you so much, and stay healthy.